Mostly, when people think about non-racialism, the ideas that come up are either color blindness or post-racialism. And my talk today speaks from the other side of those terms, from the other side of power. And it's entitled The Sea as Counter-Archive. Now, the spirit of my contribution this afternoon lives in one sentence. There is much more to the sea than its surf and its beaches. And I think that what I might be doing is to continue from where I gathered Xolela Mantu's lecture left the people on the bus. And I might be setting some of the scene for Siraj's talk on Isaac Tabata. Now, briefly, what I suggest is that a non-nativist version of Pan-Africanism and early 20th century black leftist thought are two compasses for recuperating non-racialism as anti-colonial discourse and practice. Sorry, I'm a teacher, so I usually stand and walk. I'm not used to sitting. No, well, I won't use the platform, but I think I might just stand. Otherwise, I'm just locked in. Yeah, so what I want to suggest is that a non-nativist version of Pan-Africanism and early 20th century black leftist thought are two compasses for recuperating non-racialism as anti-colonial discourse and practice. And these compasses help navigate the ways ideas circulated across the Atlantic. And I deliberately use the word circulation here, back and forth. I close with one other way in which the sea might offer a counter-archive. Cape Town's connections to St. Helena Island in the Atlantic and to the worlds of the Indian Ocean. So one possibility for a counter-archive lies in a history of non-racialism as connected to Pan-Africanism, understood as a decolonizing movement against colonial exploitation and for anti-colonial subjectivities which transcend tribal, racial, and parochial affiliations. Non-racialism in South Africa begins as an idea of non-European political unity, posited as a necessary premise for oppositional practice in the context of white supremacist strategies of divide and rule and their intimate articulation with global capitalist relations. It begins not from a place of indifference to difference, to quote Achille Mbembe at one of the very first lectures to this process. It begins not from a place of indifference to difference, but from an acute awareness of salient and divisive racial identifications, both between Europeans and non-Europeans, and among non-Europeans as a lived social reality, and a determination to change that social reality. For example, Ben Kiss, a key intellectual and founder of the non-European unity movement, vividly described this social reality as follows. And I'm going to read two deeply derogatory words, so please do bear in mind where they come from. The white minority looks upon the African as a raw Kaffir And such he has been to the majority of coloureds and Indians. The white minority looks upon the coloured as a bastard Hottentot, and such he has been to most of the Africans and Indians. The white minority looks upon the Indian as a bloody coolie, and such he has been to most Africans and coloureds. The African is told he is superior because he is pure-blooded, and he has believed this. The coloured man is told he is superior because the blood of the white man flows in his veins, and he has believed this. The Indian has been told that he is superior because he belongs to a great nation with a mighty culture, and he has believed this. The slaves have taken over the segregationist ideology of their master, unquote. Now, in its 1943 draft Declaration of Unity, the non-European unity movement articulates its intention to erode this race thinking and its socio-political effects, explicitly noting that it is not an anti-European, but rather an anti-segregationist front. And what we learn from Mohammed Adhikari, one of the historians of Cape Town, is that the movement only begins to consolidate this expanded idea of non-racialism and its praxis from the late 1950s, a time that unfortunately marks both the beginning of its political dormancy and the deeper inscription of racial separation in South Africa by the apartheid state. Thus, the expanded idea of non-racialism did not emerge ready-made at the inception of the NEUM in the 1930s and 40s. Rather, it began as an idea of black political unity and unfolded from the late 1950s onward into the principle and praxis as known in the 1970s and 1980s up to the present. To recuperate a history of the idea of non-racialism, I suggest we need to trace its early expression as an idea of black political unity, an idea that travels across the submarine global networks of Pan-Africanism. In concert, several key processes and their rippling effects through North America and Africa shape early ideas of Pan-Africanism. One is the formation of the first Black Republic in 1804, Haiti, in the aftermath of slave rebellions in both the British and French Caribbean, and of the success of the 1791 uprising in Saint-Domingue. For historians of the Black Atlantic worlds, this era is a crucial turning point in the history of slavery, of racism, and of the broader meaning of democratic and human rights. Another important process is, of course, the resistance to European colonial invasions of the African continent from the 1880s. And a third is the emergence of the idea of race as a biological ranking of humans by the middle of the 19th century, along with the early dissemination of its supposed scientific validity through disciplines of the natural sciences. And of course, we see how these ideas of race as biological re-emerge in the 21st century through genomics. It is important to remember that these processes occur in the broader context of colonial expansion and resistance to it, and in the aftermath of no less than 4 centuries of resistance against slavery in the New World. Now, where does Cape Town come into this? Well, the first Pan-Africanist conference held in London in 1900 was organized by Henry Sylvester Williams, a West Indian teacher who later qualified with a law degree from Dalhousie University, Canada, and King's College London. He was admitted to the bar in the Cape Colony in 1903. And his place at the bar here was very short-lived, 1903 to 1905. Advocate Williams was among the 8 men who met in Claremont, Cape Town, in 1902 to form the African Political Organization, the first body to grow into a broad black opposition and the largest, 20,000 members at its peak in South Africa until the 1950s. Now, I do not dwell here on retrospective interpretations of the APO's elitism, its liberalism, and its ambivalent black unity concerned with gaining the franchise for civilized men. The key point here is that Henry Sylvester Williams and Francis Peregrino, a Ghanaian journalist, traveled to Cape Town with a very specific objective: to connect the message of that Pan-Africanist, that first Pan-Africanist conference, to local ideas. Now, for Du Bois, this message, the message of that first Pan-Africanist conference was, and I quote, to unite the thought and ideals of all native peoples of the Dark Continent, to unite various groups of Africans, quite separate in origin, but united in experience, and so exposed to the impact of new cultures, unquote. Now, at the heart of this thought were ideas of pride, unity, and agency among the colonized. At the heart of these ideals was freedom. At the heart of this experience was the struggle against colonial exploitation and oppression. Now, Du Bois was clear. This unity was premised on experience and ideals more than on origins or descent. It was a political unity, a politics of politics rather than a politics of blood. In the context of South Africa in the 1920s and 30s, the Hertzog-Smuts native bills bolstered a common black political identity among all oppressed people, as further manifested in the All African Convention's 1935 meeting to unite black opposition to this battery of native bills. The AAC argued that, and I quote from Manzo, the only way in which the interests of the various races which constitute the South African nation can be safeguarded is by the adoption of a policy of political identity, unquote. The non-European unity movement later expands these Pan-Africanist ideas of political unity and identification. And you will see here how I emphasize political unity as opposed to unity on the basis of origins and descent, as opposed to unity on the basis of what you look like or what your genetic heritage might be. Now, the second recuperative compass for me is early 20th century black leftist thought, a body of knowledge and praxis spanning 400 years and 3 continents, for Cedric Robinson. A body of knowledge linked to Pan-Africanism. Now, of significance to this evening is that key contributions from South Africa to this radical tradition reveal socialist politics in the early 20th century South Africa as the cauldron for the idea of non-racialism. In a rarely cited collection of writings by Maurice Hommel, we learn that among the founders and key intellectuals of the non-European unity movement are Ben Kiss, Edgar Maurice, Willem van Schoor, Ken Jordan, and Mpumelelo Temba. Hommel describes these men as, and I quote, some of the finest minds South Africa has produced, unquote, and arguably among the most important intellectuals this country has ever known, unquote. Now, more recently, Siraj Rasool, on my right here, and Crane Sodin introduce us anew to some of these leaders of the movement. Isaac Tabata, one of Kiss's contemporaries, and two leaders of a later period, Richard Dudley and Neville Alexander. Sodin provides an analysis of Kiss and Alexander's ideas, specifically on race, culture, identity, and citizenship. And I do not provide a rendition of these intellectuals' arguments here. In the context of the Cold War, and in line with North America's construction of communism as demonic, demands for racial equality in South Africa were associated with communism, seen until the early 1990s as a threat to the country's security. South Africa's admission to the United Nations in 1945 is indicative of global power players' acceptance of white South Africa as part of the West. Popular and erudite accounts, and here I refer specifically to David Everett's recent publication on non-racialism, and also to Bill Nasson's work, these accounts attribute what they call the failure of non-racialism to the absence of a clear definition of the term, to bitter internal divisions amongst organizations advocating this oppositional stance, and to political dogmatism. I argue that more than undefined terminology, internal divisiveness and dogmatic tendencies, common to most, if not all, political movements, the outcome of the Cold War was among the central factors to render marginal the idea of non-racialism because of its grounding in socialist politics. And this way of making sense of the history of non-racialism facilitates both a globally located understanding of the idea and its marginal position in South African politics today, and an awareness of the local conditions that shaped its unfolding inflections. Working with these ways in which ideas circulated across the Atlantic Ocean makes the sea a counter-archive. Now, what might narratives of family histories in and of the Cape mean for decentering Cape Town? What might those narratives contribute to the sea as a counter-archive? In a very beautiful film by Daniel Yon about the musician Satima Benjamin, who recently passed on, he tells us that Satima's grandmother was from St. Helena Island and that her maternal grandfather was from the Philippines. Both my maternal and paternal grandmothers are said to be from St. Helena Island. Moreover, these are words I remember from my mother, and she talks here to me about her grandfather. She says, "My grandfather wore a kufiya on his deathbed. His surname was Abdurrahman. When they came to the Cape, this surname changed to Adrian," unquote. These signifiers suggest a historical connection to the world of the Indian Ocean. There are several more such connections among families of the Cape. Reclaiming histories connected to what Pearson calls the Afrasian Sea, commonly known as the Indian Ocean, makes for a more fluid, a more circulating inheritance in contrast to fixed notions of heritage. It promises a move away from a politics of blood to a politics of voice. It makes our stories about reclamation more than reconciliation, reclaiming the sea as counter and transformative archive. Derek Walcott, where are your monuments, your battles, martyrs? Where is your tribal memory? Sirs, in that grey vault, the sea has locked them up. The sea is history. And in the same way that the sea is a body of living waters, what I want to suggest here is that non-racialism as an idea is a living resource that we can use and re-articulate for purposes of the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Zimitri. Now, I know we want to pause right there, but we must. I think we'll take contributions from all our panelists. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Siraj Rasool, whom quite a number of you will have already heard speaking. So it'll come as no surprise to know that he has 20 years on the District 6 as a District 6 trustee. He's the author of a hefty study on Ivy Tabata, whose portrait he pointed you to in 2 settings. He participates actively in a host of institutions, public institutions, trying to drive discussions that move well beyond the kind of minor maneuvers of transformation. I think he's the director. You direct the UWC Museums and Heritage course sometimes. So I mean, the CV here is quite substantial, but I think you're kind of getting the gist of who Siraj is. Siraj.
Thank you very much, Carolyn and Zimitri. That was utterly magnificent. I need to say just 1 or 2 things, and then we can continue after that. But if we ask ourselves, where does the idea of a District 6 museum begin? Just to connect with our discussion that we had before we came down to the Homecoming Center. I mean, there are a number of answers to that question. Many people will tell you that the museum this year is commemorating its 20th anniversary. But one of the, in our obsession with origins of everything and our biographies, and I was just thinking as Zimitri was talking that, well, actually, Henry Sylvester Williams, when he was in Cape Town, lived in my great-grandfather's house in the Buitensingel. But anyway, as everyone did when they came to Cape Town. But one of the ways in which we trace the kind of intellectual origins of the work that happens in the District 6 Museum, the anti-racist work. The District 6 Museum is primarily a project that is geared towards building a non-racial Cape Town. That is the major work of this museum as it works with these histories of removal, of race and removal. And I mean, some of the intellectual origins and the political origins of the work of this museum goes back to these fellowships and cultural societies that were started in District 6 in the 1930s, particularly the New Era Fellowship, the Spartacus Club, and a range of cultural formations where people used to gather, essentially a thwarted intelligentsia that hardly had access to an academic institution, created these alternative centers of knowledge production, some of which went on to become the basis of a national, or as they called it, a national liberatory movement, which Zimitri has spoken about in the form of the non-European unity movement. But it is these cultural clubs, like the New Era Fellowship, that met around the corner from the Methodist Mission Church building where the museum's exhibitionary work takes place, between Harrington Street and Canterbury Street, in the very building of the Stakesby Lewis Hostel, which was where young African men lived in Cape Town. That was where some of the first ideas were developed about non-racialism, in the settings of those debates in the New Era Fellowship. And it was there where the idea of creating the anti-CAD occurred in 1943. And the anti-CAD, the Anti-Colored Affairs Department, was created out of a suspicion that the state was busy creating a Colored Affairs Department along the lines of a Native Affairs Department that occurred in the 1930s as part of the Hertzog Bills and the disenfranchisement of Cape African men, and the creation of a Native Advisory Council and so forth. And so you had a number of these activists, particularly who operated in the Workers' Party and the Fourth International Organization of South Africa, who worked with the All-African Convention and who formed the anti-CAD as federal organizations. And it's very important to understand their use of the notion of federalism, because their concept of political work and of mobilization that Zimitri has referred to needed to happen, they argued, on the basis of the federal alliance of different organizations that would come together in a grand umbrella structure called the Non-European Unity Movement, consisting of these different components, particularly the All-African Convention and the Anti-CAD. And unlike the Congress Alliance of the 1950s, that was an alliance of racial organizations, imagined as a nation consisting of 4 nations, separate from each other, naturally and biologically and politically, who needed to organize separately. In the sphere of the Non-European Unity Movement, they did their political mobilization around issues. And so the anti-CAD was not a colored movement, in as much as the All-African Convention was not an African movement. These were bodies that operated on the basis of a federal structure in which a new nation was being imagined out of the political work that happened on a federal basis. But that new nation was imagined through a set of political concepts that was invented at this time. Because in the 1930s and the 1940s, as the ANC worked the institutions of oppression in the Native representation, in the Native Representative Council, and as the Colored Affairs Council was being constituted, a whole nomenclature and language and system of representation was brought into existence through Tabata and Kies and in their writings and teachings about who was a collaborator, about who was a quisling, and about the importance of the boycott and non-collaboration. Because these were the methodologies through which a non-racial nation was to be formed, was to be made. Now, that is one aspect of this history. And it is a history that you will find in a number of different places that provides an intellectual history of their concepts, of their methods, of their writings, etc. But what I've tried to do in my work is also to try and figure out how these ideas were produced in the first place. Through what relationships were they produced? Through what systems of affinity were they created? Of course, there were underground structures, and figures such as Claire Goodlatte and others who were these Trotskyists who trained I.B. Tabata and who trained Jane Gould, who trained Ben Keys and so forth. A number of figures, Claire Goodlatte, Burlak, and a number of these figures in the Workers' Party. And there is this hidden history of Marxism underneath that edifice of the national movement that was being created. But in addition to that, I was able to find the existence of a set of relations in a private space, in a space of intensity and of cultural production, involving a relationship spanning 40 years between Tabata and Dora Taylor. They were comrades who were instructed to work together secretly, to produce writing, to produce pamphlets, to produce newsletters, to generate ideas, to produce material, which was produced either under a pseudonym or anonymously, because no attention was being attracted to any individual. Because, at this time in the 1940s, if you try and find any photograph of these activists in the 1940s, you can't, because they worked as a collective. They didn't want to attract any attention to any individual. And so, except, of course, they went into Anne Fisher's studio. And so, thankfully, we have one or two photographs of Tabata. But unbeknown to many people, indeed, it can be argued, and I have suggested, that that comradeship and that relationship of intensity and that relationship of love between Tabata and Dora Taylor is the primary relationship through a number of texts of the unity movement were produced, and out of which a number of the fundamental ideas of the movement developed. And by making that argument, the movement has tried to take me to task, because it is an argument that cuts into the mythology of how politics happens, that politics happens in the public by men, and that it happens in a certain way. And it is possible to demonstrate how that is not the case. But what is tragic is that I've also been able to trace a way in which that anonymity and that comradeship and that deflection to the collective slowly but surely gave way to a politics of presidentialism. So that by the time the unity movement went into exile, the only way in which it could present itself in the forums of the OAU was as a proto-government with leaders who had biographies. And so that was the way in which these things turned. And the devoted Dora Taylor, who gave up her own writing in the service of Tabata, became the main biographer. And it is thanks to her that we have a Tabata archive. It was she who created that archive out of a sense of devotion. So it has all of her marks all over it. And it is possible to rethink the world of politics as it unfolds in the public, and to think about the evolution of political ideas and political movements in a new way. And I hope that more studies of that nature will be able to be produced.
Thank you, Siraj. It never occurred to me you would be so succinct. But you have had a double billing here, so I know we'll get lots from you in the question time. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Premesh Lalu. Like Siraj, Premesh is a professor of history at UWC. He's director of the Centre for Humanities Research at UWC, and is pursuing an extraordinarily dynamic career in getting people to do the kind of work that gives us some intellectual hope for the future. I find it really a fabulous centre. So, and Premesh, I think you've also been or are a trustee of District 6, a past trustee of the District 6 Museum. And of course, many of you will know him as the author of The Deaths of Hintsa. So, Premesh, I think without further introduction, I'm going to let you give us the title of your talk, which I wish to propose. I mean, I haven't been part of this entire trip, but I imagine it has to be a nominee for the best title.
Well, thanks. That's a lot of pressure. Thank you, Carolyn. The title is Bruce Lee, Bantu Biko, Dollar Brand, Brothers with an Imperfect Timing, or Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting. There are actually 3 titles there, and the problem was that I couldn't decide on one. So thank you very much, Carolyn. Well, let me start by saying that I'm drawn to the provocative title of this session because it allows me to pursue a line of argument that has seen my earlier work on the deaths of Hintsa fall on the deaf ears of historians. What annoyed historians was an implicit suggestion that a work of art may offer us better ways to think about the relationship of colonialism to apartheid and the post-apartheid than the archive, nationalist narration, and the museum put together. I now wish to ask what it would mean to think of history as a work of art. My initial impulse was to approach the talk as an artist might approach a painting, not through the assemblage only of form and materials, but technique. A particular inspiration came from a passing idea in the Handspring Puppet Company's lecture, I Love You When You're Breathing, which was performed at the opening of the CHR's Love and Revolution conference. In an otherwise forgettable moment, the puppeteer is addressed by the puppet, which proceeds to inform him that all movement is thought. At first, we may be forgiven for hearing in the statement a commonplace notion that one cannot have movement without thought. But listen carefully. All movement is thought. Are we not invited to consider that movement, speed, slowness, rhythm, arrhythmic movement, interval, might be the very quality of thought that proves elusive to our notion of the archive? I plan to draw on this theme for today's talk, but all that changed on the 8th of June 2014. In an itinerant moment, I was, as they say in Cape Town, bunking the conference. While wandering the streets of Hong Kong, I stumbled into the Hong Kong Heritage Museum's exhibition titled Bruce Lee, Kung Fu, Life and Art. Nothing could have prepared me for that experience. I was both moved and enormously troubled by the encounter with Bruce Lee in Hong Kong. Beyond the memories that Bruce Lee conjured of a more precarious time of growing up in the suburb of Athlone in Cape Town, the exhibition set into motion a statement by Deleuze that says that the use of philosophy is to sadden. True to form, the Bruce Lee that I encountered in the Hong Kong Heritage Museum was largely unknown to me. There, in the context of the exhibition, Bruce Lee was locked into a story of globalization, both critically and consequently poised in relation to the all-too-visible concretization of capitalism on the Hong Kong skyline. It was a Bruce Lee caught between the East and the West, maybe even trapped there to have his fate decided for the remainder of time. The exhibition drew attention to his life, art, and philosophy through the mediation of all too brief snippets of his philosophical musings. That's not for me, I tell you. His philosophical musings, his martial arts creations, film productions, and his library. There were objects from his wardrobe, still and moving images from his films, extracts from his writings, and a selection of his vast collection of books. And one which I asked for, which is the yellow tracksuit he wears in The Game of Death, was refused to me. But I was dissatisfied at the thought of being interpolated by a story of Chinese modernity. What the exhibition signaled was not the victory of capitalism over that of the struggle against colonialism. Rather, what it indicated was the waning of the desire that underwrites the discourse we now too hastily call post-colonialism. At the heart of my battle with the exhibition was the way that affect had been conscripted to the triumphant narrative of East meets West. That story had its own justification in the internal struggles between Southern nationalism and centralizing processes of Beijing. But what about the Bruce Lee, who was a philosopher of sadness, who with Steve Biko and Dollar Brand awakened my senses while growing up in the shadows of Table Mountain, where contours drawn in sand disappear as hurriedly with the wind that locals call the Cape Doctor, leaving in its wake little or no trace of a desire that once lived there. This is a feeling most poignantly indicated by the late Peter Clark in a work titled Wind on the Cape Flats, an image that gustily leaves behind a resonant shadow of sadness, but never the contours of thought. I have attempted to respond to this difficulty by proposing that we might want to return a project of thought to those very spaces of Athlone where once upon a time there were major student formations that had taken root. But I do not want to talk about that tonight. What I want to address is the second suggestion, that I wish to write a book about those three moments that catalyzed and opened up a set of possibilities for young people in Athlone. The book project, then, would connect my interest in the theme of sadness and a world that I once inhabited accidentally by virtue of the decree of apartheid's forced removals. I did not simply seek to reclaim sadness as a residual feature of the post-colonial, but to find in it the productivity of a thought that disturbed the illusions of our modernity. Referencing more directly the theme of this discussion, mine is a project that draws lines in the sand, aimed at moving sadness into thought, and in the process to imagine the contours that gave us wind blowing on the Cape Flats. Why then Bruce Lee to articulate such an expansive question about post-coloniality? In a recent book titled Beyond Bruce Lee, and as I was saying the other day, I don't think that we are ever beyond Bruce Lee, Paul Bowman argues that a considerable part of what we call cultural studies can be mapped onto the figure of Bruce Lee. Whether it's Zizek's refinement of ideological critique, or Rancière's distribution of the perceptible, or Althusser's notion of interpolation, or Adorno's critique of the cultural industry, Bruce Lee allows one to think of cultural studies as a specific grid of intelligibility that probes the relation between discourse and society. Bowman does much to resurrect a post-colonial claim in his Beyond Bruce Lee, but he needlessly, in my view, reduces the question of the post-colonial as a specifically geopolitical question of race. While I'm persuaded by much of what Bowman has to offer, I do wonder whether the productive rescripting of Bruce Lee forgoes a more fundamental question of Lee's relation to the discourse of history. The reason why Bruce Lee emerged as an iconic reference in the struggles of Cape Town in the 1970s is precisely because of his untimely and belated arrival. In fact, Bruce Lee's emergence depended on similarly untimely figures such as Steve Biko and Dollar Brand, all brothers with an imperfect timing, each of whom proved irreducible to the time of history. If history is a discourse that refuses to disclose its desire, and if it erodes its imaginary structure to achieve what Roland Barthes calls a reality effect, what is Bruce Lee's place in post-colonial and post-apartheid history? There is a second reason for turning to Bruce Lee. Today, the post-colonial is saturated with talk about China in Africa. Judging from contemporary discourse of the BRICS variety, China seemingly appears to have no particular use for a symbolic understanding of Africa. Perhaps that was because the symbolic is being expended on regional nationalist claims against Beijing's centralized control. Africa, as a consequence for many, appears to China only as a resource interest. It is against this backdrop that this book that I propose to write sits. By placing Africa in relation to China, I do not wish to replay the tired old script of inclusion and exclusion, or make a further argument for provincializing China, or merely campaign for inclusion in a story of the comparative tragedy that we call globalization. Mine is a modest attempt to write the story of the struggles of the 1970s and 1980s by asking for a history of the unconscious desire that underwrote political resistance before it manifested in ideological formations. In the process, I wish to speak to Chinese scholarship by reminding us that the rise of regional nationalisms in the south of China today, or the centralization of the party in Beijing, rests on the working out of the desire to be post-colonial that is not entirely unfamiliar to Africa. Perhaps what we are now compelled to ask is what's left of the post-colonial debate after the impasse that contemporary China registers. Several strands suggest themselves for this study. If there was an absent cause in the movement of students in 1976, 1980, and 1985 that connected them as youth on the dusty outskirts of Cape Town to the world, it was less the highly selective, mediatized images of street fighting than it was perhaps the availability of access to the bioscope. Bruce Lee inaugurated much of the cinema, even single-handedly proposed another vision for living under the authoritarianism of apartheid. This is the first ambition of the book that I propose to write, to track the rebellion of students in Cape Town by pressuring it to reveal its filmic language and unconscious. In this respect, I'm not interested in a social history of Bruce Lee in Cape Town, even though the experience of watching Bruce Lee films in Cape Town was an extremely social occasion. In fact, the many who bear the scars of those moments. Nor simply do I want to delineate his considerable influence in fostering rebellion amongst youth. Rather, I will be as true as possible to the question of the problematization of race that may have ensued from the weekly encounters with Bruce Lee in cinemas spread across the Cape Flats. Bruce Lee arrived in Cape Town at about the same time that Bantu Biko did. Biko was as you all know, the black consciousness figure who had led a charged political response to apartheid education across South Africa. Making sense of the complex formulations of black consciousness, where political literacy had been stunted by a rapidly eroding and repressive educational experience, required a supplementary idiom for purposes of translation. Such a translator, I believe, could be found in Bruce Lee, who offered weekly lectures in the form of filmic aphorisms and affirmations of the very argument that black consciousness tried to communicate. And I'll give you one example for your benefit, Zimitri. This is from Bruce Lee. Don't get into one form, adapt it and build your own and let it grow. Be like water. Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like water. Now you put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend. This is the second ambition of this book then, to discover the intertextuality in the translation of black consciousness that will allow us to think of Bruce Lee and Steve Biko as thinkers of the same order and movement. While some may think this to be a banal and perhaps even ridiculous inquiry, I wish to I wish to differ. I suggest that we find resonance of this movement in thought in the music of Abdullah Ibrahim. Himself a product of the Cape Flats and martial arts, Ibrahim's Manenberg not only functioned as an anthem in the struggle against apartheid, but as a composition, also sounded out the notes that would connect the movement discernible in Bruce Lee and Steve Biko. This then is the third ambition of the book I propose, to inquire into the fate of movement that brought the students of 1976, 1980 and 1985 face to face with the apparatus of apartheid. I trace the tonality of sadness in Ibrahim's music to indicate the productivity of what is otherwise considered useless knowledge in the formation of a post-apartheid future. But what connects these three phenomena, Bruce Lee, Bantu Biko, and Abdullah Ibrahim? It is less their heroic stance in the discourse of liberation than their arduous commitment to enable thought about aesthetic education. Each functions to unfold the possibility of approaching the precarity of the political world. if they are all assembled by their respective commitments to rhythm, I will argue it is because beneath this semblance, we may discover an unequivocal arrhythmic movement. I want to call that arrhythmic movement sadness, an unstable idea without which the desire for anything post-colonial or post-apartheid is inconceivable. Such an arrhythmic movement owes itself to a concept of nomadic art, an art without institution that is both initiatory and focused on the connections between art and technique rather than form and material. In the cherished ideals of the struggles against racial oppression that marked human societies for the past number of centuries, sadness often overreached tragedy, grief, mourning, and melancholia by an arm and a length. Alongside its fellow travelers that found a home in theater, politics, and psychoanalysis, sadness reached deep into the relations established amongst humans. There, in the realm of relations in the lived world, it would incubate the birth of a future that would recall again and again the unstable foundations of the discourse of history that once extended a lease on life unto it. Capable of grinding all the other senses to a halt, sadness would proceed to infect every sensibility by which the subject of politics would come to be known. It is true that sadness has a debilitating quality in the experience of apartheid in South Africa. A history peppered with forced removals, Bantu education, immorality acts, land dispossession, imprisonment, states of emergency, and security force violence cannot but know sadness intimately. It forms a baroque quality of the South African experience. In fact, in much historiography, sadness functions as a normalizing impulse through which to garner solidarity and to prompt action. It is what drives consciousness, and indeed the content of what is given over to the all-encapsulating notion of struggle history. But there is, I wish to argue, a trope of sadness that is so unstable as to be rendered repressed as a feature of the South African psyche. In this sadness, I believe we may find the resources to craft what is specific to the desire to overcome apartheid. Earlier, I argued that such a desire to overcome apartheid will be served by supplementing its critique with a post-colonial critique of apartheid. I now believe that such an idea may prove inadequate, especially given the realignments currently unfolding in global geopolitics and economics between the East and the West. Perhaps the time may have arrived where it may prove necessary to pressure the post-colonial with the insistence of the post-apartheid, and to suggest that the only post-colonial sensibility worth salvaging from the remains of the struggle against apartheid is one which is committed to elaborating a concept of the post-apartheid where no such object is available as such. To track the unconscious arrival of this thought, to rediscover its language, I wish to return to a place where unlikely flows once encountered each other in a troubling assemblage of productive sadness. That space is Athlone in Cape Town, a place which came to house much of the surplus people of apartheid's forced removals and which formed a major nexus of competing political traditions in the critique of apartheid. A place of cinema, politics, and music, Athlone is now merely an abandoned site of memory, a site reduced to apartheid's atrocity in a city that accords it the status of a place but not a space. No thought of political significance, it seems, is readily attributed to the fires and passions which once burned there. And the legacies of its writers and intellectuals are mostly rendered inconsequential and forgotten to this process. Apartheid planners carved up Athlone into racially designated group areas. In its initial imagining, the place would be earmarked as a native township by the local state. By 1948, with the advent of nationalist rule, a tussle between local and national interests, one economic, the other political, resulted in the area being a designation and a destination for the thousands removed along the base of Table Mountain that cuts the peninsula. Okay. The angry divide of the garrison city now puts this space of apartheid social engineering alongside the design capital frenzy of those who live at the foot of the mountain. Yet it is precisely there, in apartheid's wastelands, that a struggle for ideas once burst through the barriers of race to produce an all too brief glimpse of what was possible after apartheid. It was here in the intermingled condition of life under apartheid that 3 successive student movements took root. But what distinguished these movements beyond the ideological identification and organization has yet to be adequately explained. Why, for example, did students of Athlone make common cause with the youth of Soweto against the institution of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction when they themselves mostly spoke Afrikaans? To answer that question, we should look at the subsequent movements of 1980 and 1985, which targeted the discipline of history for being an instrument of apartheid oppression. What then was at stake in the critique of history that Bruce Lee, Steve Biko, and Dollar Brand might reveal? At one level, the student movement can be seen as demanding representation in an institutional setting from which they were increasingly excluded. The struggles in this reading might take as its inaugural moment the dissatisfaction with the cosmetic changes that apartheid undertook with the tricameral system, a system of separate representation in a parliament that nevertheless excluded those designated as African. But this is only part of the story and not the most interesting. In fact, it proved difficult to argue for representation other than on the racial and ethnic grounds of apartheid. Ultimately, this was a story that operated at the level of the Demise and at the level, that is, of seeking reconciliation that was only skin deep. More pertinently, the student movement engaged a critique of history premised on the understanding that history killed desire, thought, and movement. At a basic level, this was a process of asking for a reconciliation, not of the Demise, but of the difference that marked the past from the present. Stated differently, it was a desire for a concept of difference that was different to apartheid's difference. In the impossibility of realizing such a reconciliation, the students of the 1980s were carving a space for desire, thought, and movement to reveal themselves as potentiality in opposing apartheid. Enter the Dragon, Black Consciousness, and the anthem-like piece called Manenberg made crossover a fashionable undertaking. And that is what Athlone became, a crossover space. Beneath the masculinist aggression lay an ideal that located, if not unmoored, the self in space. Bruce Lee, Steve Biko, and Dollar Brand were all enamored by the martial arts. But rather than producing a social history of race, which today I would argue is wrecking institutions once occupied by the students of Athlone, Lee, Biko, and Brand produced the possibilities of a non-racial sensibility to take root in the midst of apartheid. More importantly, together, they enabled a problematization of the problem of the cultural industry that marked out apartheid's instrumentalization as a specific limit. In its place, they gave us a specific way to rethink the cultural industry along the lines of the technical becoming of the human, of relations of bios to techne, in ways that radicalized thought of the possible. It is here in the squandered opportunity to rethink the cultural industry along lines that may give us a different relation between the concept of the human and the structural mechanism we call production, that we might begin to discover the possibilities of a post-apartheid that is for all intents and purposes post-colonial, if not more. That may mark the beginning of a process of moving sadness towards thought. Thank you.